Hey guys, tonight we step off a perfectly ordinary wooden dock and straight into the coldest, windiest, most politely stubborn place on Earth. You can smell tar and salt in the harbor air as gulls wheel overhead, shrieking like they know something you don't. The ropes creak, the gangplank trembles, and somewhere beyond the horizon waits Antarctica, an entire continent devoted to ice, wind, and the delicate art of not freezing solid. You're wrapped in wool that already itches. Your boots feel heavier than your future. And someone behind you is arguing about tea rations as if civilization itself depends on them. In a way, it does. You probably won't survive this. Not because you're weak, but because you've grown fond of central heating, online grocery deliveries, and not having to chip your morning coffee out of a frozen mug. Early Antarctic explorers did not have those luxuries. They had wooden ships, questionable insulation, and a deeply emotional attachment to boiling water. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me your location and local time. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from as we drift together toward the bottom of it. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is the early 20th century, the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Ships like Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery and later Ernest Shackleton's Endurance push south through grinding pack ice, their hulls reinforced but still groaning like old floorboards. Historically speaking, this era, roughly 1897 to 1922, marks the most intense period of human attempts to reach the South Pole. That's your mainstream fact for the evening. No satellites, no GPS, no motivational podcasts, just sextants, courage, and an astonishing amount of tea. You step aboard a wooden vessel that smells of coal smoke, damp wool, and optimism. The deck is slick with frost. Sailors move with practiced balance as the ship eases away from the dock. The land recedes, and with it, any reasonable decision-making. You lean against the rail and watch the shoreline shrink, trying not to think about how long you'll be gone. 2 years, perhaps more. Long enough to forget the taste of fresh fruit. Long enough to start naming icebergs like neighbors. Below deck, crates are stacked tight. Pemmican, hardtack biscuits, tins of meat, medical supplies, scientific instruments, and carefully sealed chests of tea. The British, in particular, consider tea not a luxury but a necessity. It is warmth, routine, morale, and mild denial in leaf form. Quirky tidbit. Some expeditions packed more tea by weight than certain scientific instruments. If you're going to measure magnetic fields at the edge of the world, you might as well do it with a decent brew. As the ship pushes south into rougher seas, you discover that tea also doubles as a seasickness strategy. When the Southern Ocean begins its performance, rolling swells like moving hills, you cling to your bunk while tin mugs slide dramatically across tables. Historians still argue whether the daily ritual of tea was more about hydration or psychological stability. But when you're staring at a horizon that tilts like a confused painting, a hot, familiar taste can convince your stomach that civilization still exists. The days blend into a rhythm: watch duty, maintenance, scientific notes, and at appointed hours, tea. Always tea. The cook wedges himself near the galley stove, bracing against the ship's sway. Water sloshes in iron kettles. Someone inevitably jokes that if the ice doesn't crush the ship, the tea stains will. You laugh, because the alternative is contemplating the phrase, ice pressure. The cold intensifies gradually, politely at first. Frost feathers along the rails. Your breath becomes a constant ghost. You begin to understand that Antarctica does not announce itself with drama. It simply removes degrees of warmth until you notice you can't feel your toes. And still, the kettle whistles. There's something quietly rebellious about it. You are sailing toward a place described by earlier explorers as a white desert. A continent larger than Europe and almost entirely uninhabited by humans. The first confirmed landing on the Antarctic mainland likely occurred in 1821. Decades before your current voyage. Those early sightings were brief, cautious. Now you're heading in with crates, dogs, scientific ambition, and tea leaves measured with naval precision. At night, in your cramped bunk, You hear the hull cutting through water and think about what lies ahead. Ice floes thick as small countries. Temperatures plunging far below zero. Months of darkness. You imagine the first moment you'll see the continent itself, a pale line on the horizon. Too bright to look at directly. You also imagine holding a mug between your palms while the wind howls outside. Steam curling upward like a small, defiant cloud. It becomes clear, even before landfall, that tea is less about flavor and more about structure. When everything else is uncertain, the weather, the ice, the return date, the boiling of water is predictable. You scoop leaves, you pour, you wait. It's almost meditative. You begin to look forward to those pauses more than the grand goal of planting a flag somewhere invisible on a plateau. Someone on deck claims that if you spill tea in Antarctic waters, the ocean will politely return it as an iceberg. That's not scientifically accurate, but it earns a tired chuckle. Humor out here is dry, understated, and frequently about beverages. The first icebergs appear like floating cathedrals, blue and luminous against gray sea. You stand at the rail again, mug in hand, watching as the ship threads between them. The air tastes sharper now, metallic and clean. You realize you are crossing into a different scale of existence. The continent ahead does not care about your ambitions. It does not care about your carefully folded socks. It certainly does not care about your tea. And yet, you carry the ritual with you. As stubborn as the explorers themselves. The dock is long gone. The familiar world has dissolved into open water and floating ice. You take another sip, lukewarm already in the wind, and feel something steady settle in your chest. The journey has begun, and the kettle, improbably, is already the heart of it. The ship pushes deeper into southern waters, and the world becomes a study in gray and white. The Southern Ocean does not roll so much as heave, lifting you skyward and dropping you with a wet, indifferent shrug. You learn to walk with bent knees, one hand always gripping a rope or rail. Below deck, everything that isn't tied down develops ambitions of becoming airborne. Tin plates slide, boots migrate, at least one bar of soap achieves a dramatic career in slapstick. And yet, at precisely appointed hours, the kettle goes on. Life aboard these wooden expedition ships, like Discovery, Terra Nova, or later Endurance, is astonishingly structured. That's your mainstream historical fact. Most British Antarctic expeditions were run with Royal Navy discipline. Even when technically civilian, watches are kept, logs are updated, and tea breaks are observed with almost liturgical consistency. The Empire may be thousands of miles away, but its schedule lives on in enamel mugs. You duck into the galley, where the cook braces himself against a bulkhead while coaxing a Primus stove to life. The smell of paraffin mingles with damp wool and the faint sweetness of tea leaves. Water, precious and carefully rationed, sloshes in a dented kettle. Fresh water is limited. Much of it must be melted from ice once you reach pack. For now, barrels and tanks hold your supply, and every cup poured is calculated. You wrap your fingers around a mug and let the heat bite back into your skin. Outside, the temperature hovers just above freezing. But the wind cuts through layers like it's flipping pages. Your eyelashes gather tiny crystals. You look less like a heroic explorer and more like a startled pastry. The ship's carpenter mutters that the hull timbers are contracting in the cold. You hear new creaks at night, sharp, wooden pops as the vessel adjusts to the chill. These ships are reinforced for ice, but they are still wood against a continent of frozen stone. Historians still argue whether the overconfidence in wooden hulls was bravery or optimism bordering on denial. Steel ships existed, after all, but wood had flexibility, and perhaps, in some unspoken way, it felt warmer. You spend hours on deck scanning the horizon for pack ice. The first floes appear as scattered plates. Drifting lazily, the captain orders reduced speed. Sailors lean over the bow, poles ready to fend off smaller chunks. When ice scrapes along the hull, it sounds like crockery dragged across a table the size of the ocean. Inside, tea continues to anchor the day. There is morning tea, afternoon tea, and sometimes a quiet extra ration for men returning from particularly miserable deck duty. The British love of tea in polar regions becomes almost comedic in its persistence. Quirky tidbit. Some expedition diaries mention debates over whether the water should be allowed to boil fully or merely come to a lively simmer. As if perfection in brewing might compensate for the absence of, say, sunlight for months. You begin to appreciate the choreography of it. One man measures leaves from a tin carefully labeled and relabeled to prevent moisture damage. Another times the steeping by counting slowly under his breath. There are arguments, mild, restrained, very British, about strength. Builder's tea versus something more delicate. Out here, strength usually wins. Meals are basic. Salted meat. Hard biscuits that could double as roofing tiles. Tinned vegetables that taste faintly of nostalgia. Tea softens it all. You dunk a biscuit, watch it swell, and attempt to eat it before it disintegrates entirely. Timing is everything. Lose focus, and your snack becomes sediment. Above deck, albatrosses wheel effortlessly. Masters of these latitudes, you envy them their aerodynamic grace. You, meanwhile, are layered in wool, moving like a cautious laundry pile. The wind steals your words mid-sentence. Conversations are short, practical, ice to port. Secure that line. Is there more hot water? As days shorten, light takes on a peculiar quality, long, slanting, almost metallic. The sea shifts from gray to deep, inky blue. Icebergs loom larger now, sculpted by wind into arches and ridges. You pass one so close you can hear the faint trickle of meltwater running down its side. Like a distant clock. Below deck at night, you lie in your bunk listening to the hull nudge against smaller floes. The ship no longer glides, it negotiates. Sometimes it shudders to a halt, then inches forward with careful engine thrust. You imagine the vast pressure of pack ice forming further south, plates locking together with geological patience. In these moments, tea becomes less a beverage and more a reassurance. When the watch changes at midnight, a pot is brewed. When a man returns soaked from hauling lines, a mug is pressed into his hands before questions are asked. The ritual says, you are still human. Even here. You start to notice how morale fluctuates with the weather. On calmer days, there's quiet humor. Someone suggests opening a seaside cafe once you return, marketing it as authentic Antarctic breeze. Laughter is brief but genuine. On rough days, silence settles heavier than the snow. Tea breaks stretch slightly longer, as if time itself can be warmed and slowed. There's also the matter of hierarchy. Officers dine separately, but tea, at least in its simplest form, crosses ranks more easily than most privileges. A shared kettle can blur the edges of class, if only for a few steaming minutes. Historians still argue whether this subtle equality strengthened expedition cohesion or merely masked underlying tensions. From your bunk, it feels like solidarity, thin, fragrant, and vital. The pack ice thickens. By the end of the week, the ship is weaving through a labyrinth of white. Flows bump gently at first. Then with more insistence, the captain studies charts and previous expedition notes, aware that one wrong decision could mean wintering unwillingly in the grip of ice. You take your mug on deck again, steam whipping away instantly in the wind. Ahead, the horizon is no longer open sea but a jagged line of frozen plates stretching endlessly. It's beautiful in the way things are when they absolutely do not need you. The kettle whistles below, stubborn and bright. You finish your tea, set the mug down carefully, and brace yourself as the ship noses into thicker ice. Wooden hull meeting the slow, grinding edge of the continent. The ocean has carried you far enough. The real test is about to begin. The first real collision with pack ice is not dramatic. There's no cinematic crash, no heroic shouting. Instead, the ship eases forward, nudges a floe, and simply stops. A long, wooden sigh runs through the hull. You feel it in your boots more than you hear it. Outside, the sea has transformed into a slow-moving jigsaw puzzle. White plates pressing gently but insistently against one another. You've arrived at the edge of a different world. After days of cautious maneuvering, the decision is made. This is where you'll establish a base. In the case of Robert Falcon Scott's 1911 expedition, that base becomes Cape Evans on Ross Island, where a prefabricated hut is hauled ashore and assembled against wind that seems personally offended by your existence. That's your mainstream fact. Scott's Terra Nova expedition did indeed build a hut at Cape Evans, and remarkably, It still stands today, preserved by the cold like a time capsule. You help drag crates across uneven ice, boots slipping, breath frosting in thick clouds. The hut components, wooden panels, roofing beams, felt insulation, are wrestled into place with numb fingers. Someone drops a hammer, it vanishes into snow like a swallowed coin. You briefly consider how absurd it is to build what is essentially a garden shed at the end of the earth and call it home. And yet, once the walls are up and the roof secured, the space transforms. Bunks line the sides, a central table claims the middle, boxes become chairs, scientific instruments are carefully arranged, and in one corner, near the stove, space is made for the kettle. Inside the hut, smells begin to accumulate: paraffin, damp wool, tobacco, seal blubber used as fuel. It's not exactly a spa retreat, but compared to the wind outside, it feels like a cathedral of comfort. The temperature indoors hovers just below freezing at times, but with the stove going, it can climb to something almost cozy. Almost. Your job rotates daily: cooking, cleaning, tending dogs, assisting with scientific measurements. Scott's expedition, like others of the heroic age, is not solely about reaching the pole. There are meteorological observations, geological samples, magnetic readings. Antarctica is a laboratory as much as it is a proving ground. You jot down barometer readings while flexing stiff fingers, wondering if anyone back home truly grasps how much tea is required to measure atmospheric pressure. Quirky tidbit: the hut walls become decorated with advertisements cut from magazines, cocoa, soap, even corsets, pasted up as cheerful reminders of domestic life. It's branding as morale strategy. You sip your tea beneath a paper promise of finest quality biscuits, and pretend the ice outside is merely decorative. The daily schedule forms quickly: breakfast, morning duties, midday meal, afternoon work, evening lecture or reading aloud, and threaded through it all, tea breaks. The stove hisses as snow is melted in large pots. Fresh water is precious. Every drop begins as ice chipped from outside and hauled in sacks. You discover that melting snow for drinking water requires more fuel than you'd expect. It's like trying to turn a cloud into soup. Historians still argue whether Scott's reliance on ponies instead of solely dogs for sledging was a critical mistake. You overhear the debate in quieter tones among officers. For now, though, the animals are still strong, and the hut is warm enough. You focus on smaller victories, like managing to brew a pot without stray snowflakes extinguishing the flame. Outside, the Antarctic landscape stretches flat and blinding. On clear days, Mount Erebus looms in the distance, a smoking volcano on a continent of ice. Yes, Antarctica has an active volcano. You sip tea while gazing at it, because of course this place needed one more dramatic feature. The plume rises lazily, as if even the magma has adopted a slower pace. Inside the hut, evenings become communal rituals. One man reads aloud from Dickens. Another sketches caricatures of the crew with exaggerated noses and heroic mustaches. Laughter echoes off wooden beams. You cradle your mug and feel something close to contentment, despite the frost forming along the interior walls. You begin to understand that the hut is less shelter and more psychological anchor. The wind can rage at 60 miles per hour outside, but inside there is structure. The kettle boils at predictable intervals. The mugs are chipped in familiar ways. Even arguments, about rations, about sledging plans, about whether the tea is too weak, become reassuring in their repetition. On your first night alone on watch, you step outside the hut into a silence so complete it feels padded. The sky is a pale wash of color, the sun circling without fully setting in the austral summer. Your breath hangs in front of you, briefly illuminated. The ice creaks and shifts faintly, like distant floorboards in a giant, frozen house. You realize then how small the hut truly is against this vastness. A wooden speck at the edge of a continent larger than Europe. And yet, it contains laughter, arguments, scientific ambition, and a kettle that never seems to rest. Back inside, you help prepare the evening tea. The leaves are measured carefully. Supplies must last through winter. There's a quiet pride in efficiency. A well-brewed cup feels like competence made visible. Someone jokes that if Antarctica ever becomes fashionable, They'll charge admission for authentic polar tea experiences. You imagine tourists queuing politely in parkas, asking for soy milk. The thought makes you smile into your mug. As days pass, you grow used to the rhythm, wind, work, warmth. The hut settles slightly into the snow, as if nestling down for a long sleep. You run your hand along the wooden wall and feel the faint vibration of the stove's heat. Tea, again, marks the hours, not loudly, not ceremoniously, just steadily. Outside, temperatures can plummet below -20 degrees Celsius even in early season. Inside, steam curls upward in fragile spirals, disappearing into air that is still, blessedly still. You take a long sip and listen to the murmur of voices around the table. The expedition's grand objective, the South Pole, lies hundreds of miles away across glaciers and crevasses. That challenge waits patiently. For now, survival means tending the stove, melting the snow, and passing the tin of tea leaves with care. The hut stands firm against the wind, and you, improbably, feel almost at home at the bottom of the world. The ice does not crash in like a villain. It closes in politely, almost apologetically, with soft grinding nudges that become firmer each day. When you shift now to the deck of Endurance under Ernest Shackleton in 1915. The sea is no longer a pathway but a tightening grip. The ship is beset in the Weddell Seapack ice. Locked fast by January, that's your solid historical anchor. Shackleton's Endurance became trapped in ice and eventually was crushed and sank later that year, forcing the crew into one of the most famous survival stories in polar history. But at this moment, early in the entrapment, there is still optimism. The ice might release you. It has moods. After all, perhaps it will reconsider. You step carefully across the frozen surface surrounding the ship. It's strange walking at sea level on something that should be liquid. The ice stretches outward in rippled plains, pressure ridges rising like frozen waves. The ship lists slightly as the flows shift beneath her. Her timbers groan in low, uneasy notes. Inside, routine is everything. Shackleton understands morale like a seasoned host at an awkward dinner party. He insists on structure, regular meals, assigned duties, and yes, tea breaks as faithfully observed as any naval tradition. The stove is lit. The kettle, dented but determined, is filled with chipped ice melted down into drinkable water. You sit at the long mess table, mug warming your palms, and try not to listen to the distant crack of ice pressure against the hull. It sounds like a slow-motion thunderstorm, muted but persistent. Someone remarks that at least the ice keeps the drinks cold. It's not a strong joke, but it earns a tired grin. Historians still argue whether Shackleton's greatest strength was logistical skill or emotional intelligence. Watching him move among the men, you sense it's the latter. He joins tea breaks, keeps conversation light, assigns small, achievable tasks. He knows idleness breeds despair faster than frostbite. Outside, the temperature drops steadily as austral winter approaches. The sun dips lower each day, tracing shorter arcs. You help unload supplies onto the ice in case the ship must be abandoned. Crates of food, sledges, canvas tents, and tea tins are hauled onto a stable floe. There is something surreal about planning your life atop a drifting platform of frozen ocean. Quirky tidbit. During the long months trapped in ice, the crew of Endurance organized soccer matches and even dog races on the floes to stay active. Imagine chasing a ball across a frozen sea while knowing your ship might be slowly compressing behind you. You finish your tea and lace your boots for a game. Because what else is there to do? The ship's cat, Mrs. Chippy, actually a male cat, despite the name, pads confidently across the deck. Unimpressed by the apocalypse, you envy that composure. When the ice squeezes tighter, the hull creaks like an old staircase stepped on by giants. You lie in your bunk at night, listening. Each crack could be the one that matters. Tea becomes a punctuation mark in an otherwise shapeless expanse of time. Morning. Check the pressure ridges. Brew a pot. Afternoon. Mend clothing. Brew another. Evening. Read aloud from whatever books were packed. Pass the mug along. Steam curls upward, briefly visible in lantern light before vanishing. The cold has a personality now. It seeps into seams, into boot leather, into the spaces between thoughts. You wake to frost forming delicate fern patterns on interior beams. The air smells faintly of damp canvas and paraffin. When you exhale, your breath lingers like a quiet ghost. One afternoon, the pressure intensifies. The ice grips the hull with unmistakable force. You feel a shudder run through endurance. A vibration deep and resonant. Men rush on deck. Shackleton stands calm, observing. Orders are given evenly. There is no shouting. Inside, someone continues to pour tea. It sounds absurd, but the act steadies your hands. You wrap fingers around enamel, chipped at the rim. The heat travels slowly through stiff joints. Outside, a loud crack echoes, wood splintering under pressure. The ship tilts more noticeably now. When it becomes clear that endurance cannot survive, preparations accelerate. Supplies are moved fully onto the ice. Tents are pitched. The crew establishes ocean camp atop a floe. You watch as the ship that carried you south becomes a patient in critical condition. Her beams bowing. And still, tea. On the ice, the routine resumes with stubborn determination. Snow is melted in large pots. The Primus stove sputters. Temperamental in the wind, you crouch around it with others. Forming a human windbreak, the kettle rattles softly as it heats. There's a peculiar comfort in continuity. The ship may be doomed, but the ritual survives. You sip and feel a fragile thread connecting you to docks far away. To kitchens with tiled floors and predictable weather. When endurance finally succumbs in November 1915, crushed by relentless ice pressure, you stand on the floe and watch her stern rise. Then sink. The sea swallows wood and iron without ceremony. It is quieter than you expected. Someone hands you a mug. The ice beneath your boots drifts northward slowly, carrying you with it. The plan now is survival, not conquest. Shackleton speaks calmly of patience, of waiting for the floe to carry you closer to open water. The sun disappears entirely as winter sets in. Darkness stretches long and unbroken. Lantern light flickers against canvas walls. In the blackness, tea glows faintly amber in your cup. A small, defiant warmth. You take a careful sip, listening to the distant groan of shifting ice. The ship is gone. The continent remains vast and indifferent. But the kettle, balanced precariously on a Primus stove atop a wandering slab of frozen ocean, still boils. And somehow, that feels like hope. When the light finally returns in hesitant shades of gray, you are no longer living on a ship, but on intention alone. The floe beneath your boots has carried you for months, drifting northward like a reluctant taxi. Now the ice begins to fracture into smaller pieces, and the time for waiting dissolves. Boats are launched into water that looks like spilled ink between slabs of white. But before the rowing begins in earnest, there are sledging journeys to make, short reconnaissance trips across unstable ice to scout leads, test routes, and move supplies. You harness yourself alongside others, leaning forward into straps that bite into your shoulders. The sled behind you creaks over uneven surfaces, runners scraping. The Antarctic glare is relentless. Snow blindness becomes a genuine threat, without proper goggles. The reflection of sunlight off endless white can inflame your eyes painfully. That's your mainstream fact. Many early explorers suffered snow blindness before protective eyewear became standard. You adjust your makeshift goggles, wooden frames with narrow slits, to reduce the glare. Through them, the world narrows to a cinematic strip of light. Tea travels with you. In small tins tucked carefully among rations. The leaves are protected from moisture. At rest stops, a Primus stove is coaxed into life, shielded by blocks of snow cut into a low wall. You kneel around it, gloved hands hovering close but not too close. Snow is shoveled into a pot, slowly collapsing into water as heat seeps upward. There is something almost sacred about those pauses. You drop your pack, flex your shoulders, and listen to your own breathing. The wind whispers over the ice, sometimes rising into a steady hiss. The horizon is a clean, unbroken line. You pour tea into metal mugs and feel the warmth radiate outward. It doesn't last long. Heat vanishes quickly in sub-zero air, but for a few precious minutes. Your core thaws. Someone produces a biscuit from a pocket, now as hard as a geological sample. You attempt to bite it and consider filing a complaint with the manufacturer, wherever they may be. Historians still argue whether the British preference for man-hauling sledges, pulling them by human muscle, was noble endurance or flawed logistics compared to the Norwegian reliance on dogs. As you lean into the harness, boots slipping slightly with each step, you have your own opinion. It is unprintable, but polite enough for a bedtime story. The ice surface is not the smooth expanse you imagined from maps. It is chaos frozen mid-motion, pressure ridges like miniature mountain ranges. Deep cracks that must be detoured. Patches of wind-scoured blue ice slick as glass. You step carefully, probing with a pole before crossing suspicious areas. Somewhere beneath is dark water, patient and cold. During one halt, you notice how quiet it truly is. No birds, no distant trees creaking, just the faint rasp of wind and the occasional distant crack as ice shifts. It's the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. You cradle your mug and let your gaze drift across the whiteness. In the distance, a group of penguins waddles in single file, utterly unconcerned by your heroic struggle. Quirky tidbit. Penguins have been known to approach explorers with fearless curiosity, sometimes pecking at unfamiliar equipment as if reviewing it for quality control. One eyes your sled suspiciously, as though questioning your design choices. Back in camp, if you can call a ring of tents on shifting ice a camp, tea becomes evening ritual. The tents flap in the wind, canvas snapping sharply during gusts. Inside, you huddle in sleeping bags lined with reindeer fur or wool blankets stiff with frost. The Primus stove sputters between you, flame flickering blue. The water for tea tastes faintly of the ice it came from, clean, almost metallic. You sip slowly, rationing both heat and hope. The boats rest nearby, hauled up onto the floe, waiting for the moment when the ice finally forces you into open water. Frostbite lurks as a constant risk. You inspect fingers and toes nightly, looking for pale patches. The cold doesn't always announce damage dramatically, it creeps in quietly. Tea helps in small ways, restoring circulation to hands wrapped around mugs. You press the metal gently against your cheeks, just to feel warmth somewhere. There's humor, too, thin but persistent. Someone remarks that if the Empire could see you now, dragging sledges across a moving sea while arguing about steeping times, it might reconsider its priorities. Another suggests that upon return, you should open a tea room called the Drifting Flow, specialty, slightly gritty biscuits. As the days lengthen, cracks widen between ice slabs. Leads of open water snake unpredictably through the pack. The plan shifts from hauling to launching. Boats are loaded with supplies, including, carefully, the tea tins. You are acutely aware that once in the boats, fuel will be even more precious. Boiling water on rolling seas will be a challenge worthy of its own medal. On the final sledging day before launching, you pause longer than usual. The stove is lit one more time atop solid ice. Snow melts, bubbles gently, transforms. You watch steam rise into the pale sky, dissipating instantly. You take a slow sip and feel both exhausted and alert. The ice beneath you is no longer stable. It fractures with low, ominous pops. The horizon shifts as floes tilt and pivot. Tea, again, is the still point. You finish your mug, pack it carefully, and shoulder your harness for the last stretch. Soon, you'll trade sled runners for oars, ice planes for heaving gray swells. But for now, in this fragile pause between drifting and rowing, you stand on a frozen ocean, steam curling around your face, and let warmth gather in your hands before stepping forward into whatever waits beyond the next crack in the ice. When the floe finally splinters beyond negotiation, you lower the boats into a sea that looks permanently displeased. The water is a dark, rolling gray, broken by fragments of ice that bump and spin like drifting dinner plates. You climb into one of the small lifeboats, no grand vessel now. Just open wood, oars, canvas, and supplies wedged tightly at your knees. Among the sacks of biscuits, pemmican, and spare socks, the tea tins are carefully secured. Even here, especially here. You push off from the ice with a long pole, and the boat rocks in immediate protest. Oars dip into the frigid water. Your hands, already cracked from cold, grip worn handles. Each stroke feels deliberate, measured. You are rowing not just toward land, Elephant Island, eventually, but toward the possibility of continued existence. The wind picks up quickly. Spray lashes over the gunnels, freezing into a brittle crust along the edges. You chip ice away with a knife to keep the boat from growing heavier. It's a surreal routine: row, chip, somewhere between strokes. You wonder if this is what penguins feel like when they regret a swim. Mainstream history reminds you that after endurance was crushed, Shackleton and his crew indeed navigated lifeboats across treacherous seas to reach Elephant Island in April 1916. It was an extraordinary feat of seamanship under brutal conditions. You are living it now, one exhausting pull at a time. Tea in a lifeboat is not elegant. There is no tidy table, no steady stove, when you make camp on temporary ice or eventually on the rocky shore of Elephant Island. The primus is lit with cupped hands shielding the flame from wind. Fuel is rationed even more tightly than before. Every match matters. On Elephant Island, the land feels almost aggressive after months on moving surfaces. Jagged rocks, steep slopes, the constant crash of waves. It is bleak, windswept, and utterly uninhabited by humans. You haul boats ashore and flip them upside down to create makeshift shelters. Propping them up with stones. Canvas is stretched. Gaps are stuffed with whatever insulation you can improvise. Inside this low, cramped space, tea once again becomes ceremony. You crouch beneath the upturned hull, listening to wind scream across the island. The primus stove hisses and coughs before settling into a steady burn. Snow and ice are melted in a battered pot. The smell of paraffin mixes with damp wool and unwashed humanity. It's not charming, it's survival. You pass around mugs carefully. Steam rises in thin threads, instantly stolen by drafts sneaking through seams. The tea is weaker now. Leaves are reused when possible. No one complains loudly. The act of holding a warm cup is more important than the strength of the brew. Quirky tidbit. During their time marooned, the men sang songs and staged small performances to keep spirits up. Even under the upturned boats. Imagine belting out a music hall tune while wind rattles your ceiling like a persistent landlord. You sip tea and join in softly, because morale is a muscle that must be exercised. Wildlife becomes both neighbor and resource. Penguins waddle nearby in astonishing numbers, their calls echoing across the rocks. Seals haul themselves onto beaches, eyeing you with what feels like mutual suspicion. These animals provide meat and blubber, fuel for bodies and stoves alike. The cycle is practical, unsentimental. You watch penguins gather in tight huddles against the wind and think, not for the first time, that they might be the true experts here. They don't need tea, though you suspect if offered, they would at least inspect it. Historians still argue whether Shackleton's decision to leave most of the men on Elephant Island while he sailed for South Georgia in a small boat was reckless or the only viable option. From inside your cramped shelter, sipping carefully rationed warmth, it feels both terrifying and necessary. When Shackleton departs with a small crew in the James Caird, leaving the rest behind, the mood shifts. You watch the tiny boat disappear into gray waves, carrying your best hope of rescue. Silence follows, heavy and uncertain. Tea continues. Days blur into each other. You wake to the same howl of wind, the same cramped quarters. Duties are assigned: hunting, cooking, maintaining shelter, tending the sick. Frostbite nips at toes and fingers. You inspect your skin each evening by dim light. In the absence of certainty, routine becomes your map. Morning, light stove, melt ice, brew tea. Afternoon, repair clothing, check stores, brew tea. Evening, share stories, sip slowly, stretch out in damp sleeping bags. You begin to notice how the taste of tea has changed. It carries hints of smoke from blubber fuel, faint salt from ocean spray. It is no longer refined, but it is unmistakably familiar. Familiarity, here, is gold. One night, as wind batters the shelter with renewed fury, you lie awake listening to canvas snap and stones shift. You imagine Shackleton and his small crew battling monstrous waves hundreds of miles away. You clutch your mug for a moment longer before setting it down carefully. The island offers no comfort beyond what you create. No trees, no soft soil, just rock, ice, and the restless sea. Yet inside this improvised refuge, under an overturned boat, warmth gathers briefly around a primus flame. You take another sip and let it settle in your chest. Outside, the Southern Ocean performs its endless symphony of wind and surf. Inside, a handful of men lean close to a flickering stove, guarding a small circle of heat. In a place that seems determined to strip life down to its simplest elements, cold, hunger, waiting, you hold onto ritual. You boil water, you pour, you share. And in that shared steam, rising and vanishing into the drafty dark, you find a reason to endure one more Antarctic night. Even in the harshest corners of the continent, Antarctica insists on being studied. Long before rescue ships appear on distant horizons, and even while survival hangs by a thread, you find yourself participating in something that feels almost academic. Back at established bases like Cape Evans, and even in more precarious camps, scientific instruments are unpacked with gloved reverence. Thermometers are mounted, barometers are checked, magnetic readings are logged with stiff fingers. That's your mainstream historical fact. The heroic age expeditions were driven not only by the race for the South Pole, but by serious scientific goals, meteorology, geology, glaciology, and magnetism among them. Scott's expedition, in particular, collected vast amounts of data and specimens, some of which proved valuable long after the men themselves were gone. You kneel inside a drafty hut-turned laboratory, breath fogging the air, and carefully record the day's temperature. -28 degrees Celsius. The ink thickens in the pen. You warm it between your palms before continuing. Outside, the wind hums like a distant engine. The stove in the corner burns steadily, fueled by whatever is available. Coal if you're fortunate, blubber if you're not. On top, a kettle rattles faintly. It serves double duty, melting snow for drinking water and providing hot water for experiments. You begin to realize that boiling water is the foundation of everything here. Hydration, cooking, sanitation, morale, even science depends on it. You help prepare a small experiment measuring the salinity of nearby sea ice. Ice blocks are hauled in, chipped, melted, and filtered. The water drips slowly through cloth into glass containers. You note how long it takes, how clear it becomes. Tea is brewed afterward in the same space, the scent of tannins briefly overtaking the metallic smell of instruments. Historians still argue whether the scientific output justified the human cost of some expeditions, particularly those that ended in tragedy. Sitting here, carefully labeling a rock sample while snow taps against the window, the work feels quietly significant. You are not just surviving, you are observing. Quirky tidbit. During Scott's final return journey from the pole, he and his companions dragged with them 35 pounds of geological specimens. Even as conditions worsened, imagine prioritizing rocks while frost creeps into your boots. It's either heroic dedication or the most extreme case of, I'll just grab this one last thing, in history. You pour tea into chipped mugs and pass them around the small lab table. Steam curls up past stacked notebooks and brass instruments. Someone jokes that future scientists will study the chemical composition of your tea stains and declare them essential data. You nod solemnly, because at this point, anything is possible. Outside, the Antarctic landscape stretches in every direction, glaciers flowing slowly toward the sea, crevasses hidden beneath snow bridges, mountains etched sharp against a pale sky. The scale is humbling. You feel like a temporary scribble on an ancient page. And yet, your measurements matter. The daily temperature logs you keep will one day help scientists understand long-term climate patterns. You don't know that yet, but the data accumulates carefully, line by line. Even in isolation, you are connected to a future you cannot imagine. Tea punctuates each session. Before heading out to check instruments, you warm up with a cup. After returning, cheeks stung and eyelashes frosted, you thaw your fingers around another. The kettle becomes as essential as the barometer. You step outside to inspect a small weather station, a simple setup of thermometers and wind gauges mounted on poles. The wind today is sharp but steady. You jot down readings quickly before your hands protest. Snow crystals skate across the surface in delicate spirals. Back inside, the hut feels almost bustling by comparison. Boots are stamped free of snow. Gloves are hung near the stove to dry. The kettle whistles softly, as if clearing its throat. There's a rhythm to this life. Observe, record, brew, repeat. You find comfort in the predictability of it, in a place where ice can crack without warning and storms can arrive like uninvited guests. The act of measuring something, anything, feels like reclaiming a sliver of control. At night, lectures are sometimes given. One man might explain the geology of the Ross Sea region, another describes magnetic declination with earnest enthusiasm. You sit wrapped in blankets, mug in hand, listening to talk of invisible forces beneath your feet. The wind rattles the hut, but inside there is curiosity. It feels almost rebellious to pursue knowledge here, to ask questions of a continent that answers mostly with silence. Historians still argue whether the culture of Stoicism among British explorers suppressed open expressions of fear or simply reflected the norms of their time. As you sip tea and quietly admit to yourself that yes, you are afraid of the next blizzard, you suspect it's a bit of both. The flame on the stove flickers low. You add fuel carefully, mindful of dwindling stores. The kettle is refilled with snow, packed tight to melt efficiently. You've become an expert in the geometry of ice chunks. Outside, the temperature continues to fall. Inside, steam rises once more, softening the hard edges of the room. You lift your mug and watch the vapor drift upward, mingling briefly with the faint smoke near the rafters. Science, survival, and tea, all bound together in this wooden shelter at the edge of the world. The data you record may travel farther than you ever will. The rocks you collect may sit in museums for generations. But right now, in this fragile warmth, your greatest experiment is simple. Can ritual outlast the cold? You take another sip and decide, quietly, that it just might. The blizzard does not knock. It arrives all at once. A wall of white that erases horizon, depth, and confidence in a single sweep. You are halfway through securing a line outside the hut when the wind shifts from brisk to tyrannical. Snow lifts from the ground and swirls upward, not falling but moving sideways in furious sheets. Within minutes, familiar landmarks vanish. The world reduces to a few feet of visibility and the persistent roar of air determined to rearrange everything you own. You stumble back inside, boots clumsy, lashes crusted with ice. The door slams shut behind you, and the hut shudders like a ship at sea. This is not a rare event. Antarctic katabatic winds, cold, dense air cascading down from the high interior, can exceed 100 miles per hour in some regions. That's your grounded historical fact. These gravity-driven winds are among the strongest on Earth, and early explorers had little protection beyond wood, canvas, and optimism. Inside the tent, because tonight you're in a forward sledging camp. Not the main hut, the canvas snaps and strains. Snow piles quickly against the windward side. Pressing inward, you and the others reinforce the interior with spare sledges and crates, wedging them strategically. And then, almost automatically, someone reaches for the Primus stove. There is something both absurd and magnificent about this reflex. Outside, nature is staging a full theatrical performance. Inside, you crouch around a metal burner the size of a small loaf of bread, coaxing a blue flame into existence. The stove sputters at first. Offended by the cold, you pump it carefully, building pressure. Finally, the flame steadies. A pot packed with snow is placed on top. It collapses slowly as it melts, requiring constant refilling. Snow is mostly air. It takes an astonishing amount to produce even a modest cup of water. You sit cross-legged, shoulders brushing canvas, listening to wind scream inches from your back. The tent walls bow inward with each gust, then snap taut again. The sound is less like fabric and more like a living thing exhaling sharply. Historians still argue whether some early sledging routes were unnecessarily risky, chosen for prestige over practicality. As you watch the tent walls ripple like a disturbed pond, you privately question every decision that brought you here. But questioning doesn't stop wind. Quirky tidbit: in extreme storms, some explorers reported hearing what they described as singing from the wind as it passed over taut ropes and tent lines, a high, eerie hum. You hear it now, a strange, thin note threading through the roar. It's almost melodic, if you ignore the existential implications. The water finally boils. Tea leaves are added sparingly. You time the steep by instinct. Watches are unreliable in this cold. The steam fills the small space quickly, fogging goggles and dampening scarves. You pass the mugs carefully. Hands shake slightly, not from fear, you tell yourself, but from cold and exertion. The first sip is almost startling in its intensity. Heat radiates outward from your throat, down into your chest. Outside, the storm continues its monologue. Inside, you focus on small tasks. Checking guy lines, brushing snow from seams, rotating positions closest to the stove so everyone has a turn at relative warmth. Tea becomes a kind of rotation schedule. Who brews? Who pours? Who refills the snow? The hours stretch. There is no point attempting to travel in this. Visibility is near zero. Even stepping a few yards from the tent risks disorientation. You imagine wandering in a white void, unable to find your way back. It's not a comforting thought. So you stay put. You talk quietly. Someone recounts a memory of green fields back home. Another describes a seaside holiday with exaggerated enthusiasm, as if trying to outshine the blizzard by sheer narrative force. The tent shudders violently at one particularly strong gust, and snow sifts in through a seam. Dusting your sleeve, you brush it away absent-mindedly. The Primus flame flickers but holds. There's a rhythm even to this chaos. Gust, rattle, pause, gust, rattle, pause. Between each wave of sound, you sip tea and let your breathing slow. You begin to understand something fundamental about these expeditions. Survival is not just about strength or planning. It is about the ability to create pockets of normalcy inside abnormal circumstances. A boiling kettle in a screaming storm. A shared joke while the wind tries to rearrange your tent into abstract art. Eventually, the intensity begins to taper. Not abruptly. Antarctica does not do abrupt endings, but gradually. The gusts grow less ferocious. The singing in the ropes softens to a low hum. You wait, cautious. No one trusts the first lull. Another pot of snow is melted. Another round of tea is poured. The taste is slightly smoky, perhaps a bit of snow carried impurities. You don't mind. It's warm. That's enough. When you finally unzip the tent flap and peer outside, the landscape has transformed. Snowdrifts have sculpted new shapes around your camp. Sledges are half buried. The world is smooth and deceptively peaceful, as if nothing dramatic occurred. You step out carefully, boots sinking into fresh drifts. The air is still, almost shy after its tantrum. Sunlight glints off the surface in sharp sparkles. Inside the tent, steam rises one last time from the pot. You take your mug and stand just outside the entrance, surveying the altered terrain. The storm has passed, leaving no apology, only rearrangement. You sip slowly, letting the warmth settle into your core. The wind may return tonight, or tomorrow, or in an hour. It always does. But for now, the flame is steady, the tent still stands, and in the fragile calm after fury, tea tastes like victory. Even at the bottom of the world, routine arrives wearing polished boots. You feel it most clearly on mornings when the sky is an uncomplicated blue and the wind, for once, has decided to mind its manners. A bell is rung or voice calls out the hour, and the camp stirs with something resembling naval precision. Blankets are folded, boots are tugged on, frost is shaken from collars. The day, no matter how inhospitable the continent, is divided neatly into segments. This is not accidental. Many of the British expeditions are steeped in Royal Navy tradition, and that structure travels south with them. Watches are assigned, duties rotate, even mealtimes are observed with surprising punctuality. That's your mainstream fact. Naval discipline shaped daily life on several Antarctic expeditions, reinforcing hierarchy and order in environments that might otherwise dissolve into chaos. You straighten your bunk, if a narrow wooden plank with blankets qualifies, and report for breakfast. Porridge is ladled into bowls, thick and earnest, and beside it, of course, tea. There is a particular choreography to the morning brew. The tin is opened, leaves are measured carefully, accounting for dwindling supply. Water, meticulously melted from snow collected the previous evening, is brought to a rolling boil. Someone taps the side of the kettle twice before pouring. a superstition that has developed without anyone fully acknowledging it. Historians still argue whether this rigid adherence to routine genuinely improved survival odds or simply maintained the illusion of control. As you line up with mug in hand, it feels less like illusion and more like lifeline. After breakfast, tasks are assigned. You might be on dog duty, checking harnesses and feeding rations. Or perhaps you assist in repairing a sledge runner worn thin by rough ice. The dogs, hardy and impatient, bark in eager bursts. They understand work differently than you do, less philosophically, more enthusiastically. Tea appears again mid-morning. A brief sanctioned pause. Even officers who maintain a certain distance in formal settings soften slightly over shared mugs. Rank does not vanish, but it blurs at the edges when everyone's breath fogs the same cold air. Quirky tidbit. Some expedition members were so particular about their tea that they brought personal strainers or favored specific blends from home. Imagine lugging a preferred infuser across the Southern Ocean. It's both charming and mildly absurd. You spend the late morning hauling supplies from a depot established miles away. The sledge runners hiss over compacted snow. Sweat forms beneath your layers despite the cold. It's an odd sensation, overheating in sub-zero temperatures. When you stop, the moisture chills rapidly, reminding you to regulate your pace. Back at camp, boots are stamped free of clinging snow. The midday meal is simple, tinned meat. Perhaps a slab of bread if stores allow. Tea follows as naturally as breathing. You begin to notice how conversations during these breaks carry subtle weight. Plans are refined, concerns are aired cautiously, weather patterns are speculated upon with more confidence than accuracy. Someone always predicts tomorrow will be clear and favorable, as though optimism itself might influence atmospheric pressure. In the afternoon, you assist with inventory. Supplies are counted, recounted, and logged. Tea tins are weighed to estimate remaining portions. The numbers are written carefully in ledgers. There is something deeply reassuring about arithmetic in a place so otherwise unpredictable. Outside, the Antarctic plateau stretches away in a vast white plain. In the far distance, a line of mountains stands sharp against the sky. The air feels thin, brittle. You pause briefly, leaning on a sledge handle, and consider how strange it is that this severe landscape is governed daily by something as gentle as steeping leaves in hot water. It's like insisting on table manners during an avalanche. As evening approaches, a more formal meal is prepared. If the expedition is fortunate, a small treat might appear, perhaps a ration of chocolate or a carefully preserved tin of fruit. Tea is brewed slightly stronger, a subtle indulgence. Inside the hut, lantern light casts warm halos on wooden walls. Shadows stretch and shift as men move about. Someone reads aloud from a newspaper months out of date, reporting on events that now feel impossibly distant. The empire churns on without you. Historians still argue whether the intense national pride driving these expeditions clouded practical judgment. Sitting here, listening to a report about parliamentary debates while wind rattles the shutters, you wonder if those politicians could endure even one Antarctic afternoon without demanding a proper kettle. After supper, equipment is inspected for the next day's tasks. Boots are placed near the stove to dry. Though never too close, leather can warp. Gloves are turned inside out. The kettle is refilled one last time. There's a quiet satisfaction in closing the day as it began, with steam rising in gentle spirals. You sit on your bunk, mug cradled, and reflect on the strange balance of this life. Discipline and fragility, ceremony and survival. The hut creaks softly as temperatures drop outside. Someone hums a tune under their breath. Another writes a note in a diary, pen scratching steadily. You take a final sip and set the mug aside carefully, as though returning a sacred object to its place. Tomorrow will bring more wind, more hauling, more measurements, perhaps even another storm. But it will also bring the same small bell, the same measured scoop of leaves, the same pause as water meets tin. And in that predictable rhythm, you find a kind of quiet strength, one that marches in step even at the end of the earth. There are evenings when the wind settles into a low murmur and the sky, briefly merciful, glows with a pale wash of pink and gold. On those nights, after duties are finished and boots are lined in obedient rows by the door, You sit at the long wooden table with paper spread before you. It's time to write home. The ink is temperamental in the cold. You warm the small bottle near the stove, turning it slowly in your hands. The nib of your pen scratches against thick paper. Hesitant at first. What does one say from the bottom of the world? Weather brisk. Spirits steady. Please water the geraniums. Tea is poured before the first sentence is complete. That's your mainstream fact for this quiet hour. Many Antarctic explorers kept detailed journals and wrote letters home. Though not all were delivered promptly, or at all. Some were left in huts. Discovered decades later, preserved by the cold like time capsules of hope and understatement. You begin with reassurances. You are well. The men are in good health. The dogs energetic. You omit the part about frost forming on your sleeping bag or the way the wind sounds like it's testing the hut's resolve. Your fingers ache as you write. You pause, lift your mug, and let warmth seep back into stiff joints. The tea tonight is slightly stronger, perhaps the cook felt sentimental. Steam rises and curls around the edges of your letter, briefly obscuring the words. Historians still argue whether the stiff upper lip tone of these letters accurately reflected morale or masked deeper anxieties. As you choose your phrasing carefully, you suspect it's a blend of both. There's no need to alarm those at home with every creak of shifting ice. Around you, others write in similar silence. One man smiles faintly as he describes the sight of penguins waddling past camp. Another stares at his page for long stretches before committing ink to paper. The hut is filled with soft scratching sounds and the faint hiss of the stove. Quirky tidbit. Some explorers carried small printing presses on expeditions, producing camp newspapers complete with mock advertisements and serialized stories. Imagine typesetting headlines while outside the temperature plummets to -30. If that isn't commitment to content creation, what is? You describe the landscape as best you can, vast, luminous, humbling. You mention Mount Erebus smoking quietly in the distance, as though it's a polite volcano. You recount a recent tea break during a storm, framing it as cozy rather than desperate. Perspective is everything. Outside, twilight stretches longer than seems reasonable. The Antarctic light behaves differently, lingering at strange angles. You pause to watch it through the frost-framed window. The world is awash in muted color, almost gentle in appearance. It's deceptive, of course. Antarctica excels at looking serene moments before becoming ferocious. Back at the table, you blot your page carefully to prevent smudging. The ink dries slowly in the cold. You sip again, noticing how the enamel mug has chipped further along its rim. It's a small imperfection, but you've grown fond of it. Familiar damage feels reassuring. The letters will be bundled carefully, stored in tins or wooden boxes, and entrusted to the next ship that makes contact. Some may not reach their destinations for years. Some may never arrive at all. You write about tea more than you realize. About how it marks the hours. About how it tastes different here, cleaner, sharper, somehow braver. You suspect your family will smile at that detail, picturing you clinging to a teacup in a snowstorm. One of the men clears his throat and reads a line from his own letter aloud. Asking for feedback. It's a poetic description of the ice fields at dawn. Someone suggests toning down the metaphor about crystalline eternity. You all nod solemnly, as though editing prose is a matter of survival. Historians still argue whether these personal writings shaped public perception of Antarctic exploration more than official reports did. Sitting here, pen hovering above paper, you realize that these small accounts, these ordinary observations, may one day define the story. You finish your letter with a careful closing. You do not say goodbye. That feels too final. Instead, you write something hopeful, something steady. The stove's flame dips lower. Someone refuels it gently. The kettle, never far from duty, is refilled once more. There is comfort in repetition. You fold your letter precisely, slide it into an envelope, and seal it with a firm press of your thumb. For a moment, you hold it between your palms, as if warmth might travel through paper across oceans. Outside, the temperature drops further. The sky deepens into indigo. Stars appear with startling clarity, sharp as pinpricks against velvet. There are more of them than you remember from home. You step outside briefly, mug in hand, to look up. The cold bites instantly at your cheeks. Your breath rises in soft plumes. The constellations feel closer here, perhaps because there is nothing between you and them but clean, frozen air. You take one last sip and let the warmth settle in your chest. Back inside, letters are stacked carefully in a tin. The table is cleared, boots are checked, blankets are shaken out. The hut settles into night with a low creak. You slide into your bunk, listening to the faint whistle of wind along the eaves. Somewhere in the darkness, a kettle lid rattles softly as it cools. Tomorrow will bring more hauling, more measuring, more wind, but tonight, ink has met paper, and steam has risen gently into lantern light. You close your eyes, letter written, mug empty, and let the rhythm of the stove's fading warmth carry you toward sleep at the edge of the world. The rivalry arrives not with shouting, but with skis. You hear about it first in fragments, rumors carried in letters, in reports from passing ships, in the quiet calculations of officers studying maps by lamplight. Somewhere across this vast white continent, a Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen is moving with efficient, unsettling speed. That's your mainstream historical fact. In December 1911, Roald Amundsen and his team became the first to reach the South Pole, beating Robert Falcon Scott's British expedition by weeks. The race, though not formally declared at the outset, became one of the defining dramas of Antarctic exploration. You imagine Amundsen's camp, skis slicing smoothly over hard-packed snow, dog teams moving in disciplined lines, tents pitched with practiced precision, and in the British hut where you sit now, tea is poured with careful deliberation. There is no panic, at least not outwardly. Instead, there is analysis. The Norwegians rely heavily on skis and dogs, both tools honed by generations of Arctic travel. The British, by contrast, often combine dogs, ponies, and human hauling in a complex logistical dance. Historians still argue whether the British underestimation of ski proficiency cost them precious time and energy. As you watch one of your companions attempt a slightly awkward glide on borrowed skis, you suspect there might be something to that theory. Tea is brewed as the discussion unfolds. Someone jokes that perhaps the Norwegians are fueled by coffee or cocoa instead, and that explains their brisk efficiency. It sparks a lighthearted debate about hot drinks and national temperament. Cocoa is dismissed by one as dessert pretending to be practical. Another counters that it's calorie-dense and sensible. You sip your tea diplomatically. Quirky tidbit. Amundsen's expedition made strategic use of dogs not only for hauling but, pragmatically, as a source of fresh meat for both men and remaining dogs during the journey. It's a harsh calculus of survival, one that contrasts sharply with British sentimentality toward their animals. The difference in approach is stark, and perhaps decisive. You step outside and try your hand at skis again. The sensation is foreign at first, balance shifting, muscles adjusting. The snow squeaks faintly beneath the wooden runners. You wobble, correct, and manage a short, surprisingly graceful glide. Back inside, tea waits like a patient tutor. The kettle hisses softly as snow melts down. The hut smells of damp wool and faint smoke. You sit at the table while an officer outlines projected distances, ration calculations, contingency plans. Numbers are precise, the weather is not. There is something almost theatrical about it. The British insistence on decorum even in competition at the edge of the world. No one openly disparages Amundsen. Instead, there are measured observations about methods, routes, depots placed at careful intervals. You cradle your mug and consider how differently the same landscape can be approached. To one team, it is a terrain to be mastered with streamlined efficiency. To another, it is a proving ground for endurance and character. Historians still argue whether national pride subtly influenced decision-making in ways the explorers themselves did not fully recognize. Sitting here, you sense pride humming quietly beneath every logistical discussion. Outside, the wind picks up slightly, brushing loose snow into delicate drifts. The plateau stretches toward an unseen pole, indifferent to flags and headlines. Inside, someone produces a small tin of cocoa saved for special occasions. There is mock outrage, traitorous beverage, someone mutters with exaggerated severity. Laughter ripples through the room. In a rare moment of experimentation, A cup of cocoa is prepared alongside the tea. You taste it cautiously. It's rich, sweet, almost indulgent. For a fleeting second, you understand the appeal. But then you return to tea. Familiar, steady, slightly bitter in a reassuring way. As news of Amundsen's success eventually filters through the polar community, reactions are complex. There is admiration, certainly, also disappointment. The pole, once an abstract objective, has become a fact with a name attached. You sit with your mug and let that reality settle. The continent does not change because a flag was planted. The ice remains vast. The wind remains sharp. Yet the race reshapes perception. Expeditions are measured not just by survival or science, but by precedence. You glance around the hut, the frost along the beams, the carefully stacked supplies, the kettle resting slightly askew on the stove. In this modest wooden room, history feels less like headlines and more like daily persistence. Someone raises a mug in quiet acknowledgement of the Norwegians' achievement. It is not a grand toast, just a brief nod to shared hardship on a shared continent. You join in, enamel rim chipped, steam rising between you. Outside, the Antarctic sky stretches pale and infinite. Inside, tea bridges rivalry with routine. The race may have been decided far from this table, but here, in the steady rhythm of boiling water and measured leaves, you find something less dramatic and perhaps more enduring than victory: continuity. You take a slow sip and let the warmth settle, knowing that flags fade, headlines yellow, but the kettle, in its unassuming way, continues to sing. There comes a point in every long expedition when the body begins to whisper its complaints more insistently. At first, it's small things: a fingertip that tingles longer than it should after exposure, a heel rubbed raw by stiff boots, a cough that lingers in the cold air. You tell yourself it's nothing. Everyone is tired. Everyone is carrying some quiet ache. But Antarctica has a way of amplifying the minor into the meaningful. Frostbite is the ever-present specter. That's your mainstream fact. Frostbite plagued many early Antarctic explorers, sometimes leading to permanent damage. Exposed skin can freeze in minutes under certain conditions, and even careful layering is no guarantee of safety. You sit on your bunk, unlacing boots slowly, examining your toes with clinical focus. Pale patches are gently rubbed to restore circulation. Not too vigorously. That can cause more harm. You've learned these subtleties through hard experience and observation. The hut is dimly lit, lantern light pooling in warm circles against wooden walls. Outside, the temperature has dropped sharply. Inside, the stove burns low but steady. Tea is already brewing. It's remarkable how often the kettle is lit in moments of physical or emotional strain. A man returns from a sledge journey with cheeks windburned and eyes narrowed against glare. He is handed a mug before questions are asked. Someone else nurses a persistent cough. Tea is offered, as though steam alone might soothe lungs. Historians still argue whether the stoicism of these expeditions masked deeper psychological tolls. Isolation, monotony, relentless cold, these are not mild inconveniences. Yet outward expressions of despair are rare in official accounts. You suspect tea functions as a kind of permitted vulnerability. No one says, "I am frightened," but someone might say, "I could use a cup." Quirky tidbit. During some polar winters, men reported vivid, almost hallucinatory dreams, likely influenced by isolation and prolonged darkness. One expedition member once described dreaming of lush gardens and hearing phantom church bells. You listen carefully at night, half expecting to hear something impossible beyond the wind. Tonight, a storm has passed, leaving the air brittle and clear. The sky outside is thick with stars, though you barely glance at them. Inside, attention is focused on a companion whose fingers show worrying signs of frostbite. You heat water carefully, not boiling, but warm enough to encourage circulation. Cloth is soaked, wrung out, applied gently. The man winces but says little. Tea waits on the table, steam curling patiently upward. You wrap your own hands around a mug and feel the heat seep into joints stiff from cold. There is something deeply human about this shared ritual in moments of fragility. The act of pouring, of passing, of waiting for the steep. Conversations tonight are softer, jokes are fewer, though not absent. Someone remarks that Antarctica should at least offer complimentary spa services given the conditions. A few tired smiles appear. The body is not the only thing tested here. Faith, too, in whatever form it takes, religious, philosophical, or simply faith in leadership, comes under quiet scrutiny. You step outside briefly for fresh air, pulling your scarf tight around your face. The snow crunches sharply underfoot. The horizon is a pale glow under starlight. Historians still argue whether leadership style was the decisive factor in survival during the heroic age. Shackleton's attentiveness to morale is often praised, Scott's stoic resolve debated. From your vantage point, leadership feels less like grand speeches and more like noticing when someone needs an extra cup of tea. Back inside, the frostbitten fingers are bandaged lightly. Circulation seems to be returning. Relief settles gently in the room. You sit at the table and watch steam rise from your mug. Illuminated in lantern light, the hut smells faintly of damp wool and metal. Tea tonight tastes slightly different, perhaps because you're more aware of its warmth. Its simplicity. You sip slowly, letting it linger. The darkness outside stretches long. During winter months, the sun may not rise for weeks. That's another grounded fact. In parts of Antarctica, the polar night envelops the land in continuous darkness. Time becomes abstract. Days blur. In that endless night, rituals gain weight. The lighting of the stove, the melting of snow, the measured scoop of leaves. You notice how even the smallest gestures, handing someone a mug, adjusting a blanket, carry amplified meaning here. There is no crowd to dilute kindness. Every action echoes slightly. You lean back against the wooden wall, mug balanced between your palms, and listen to the faint ticking of cooling metal from the stove. Fatigue presses gently at the edges of your awareness. Muscles ache in a steady, predictable way. But for now, the hut is intact. The men are present. The kettle has done its quiet work. You take another sip and close your eyes briefly. Not in sleep but in acknowledgement. In a place that strips life down to essentials, heat, food, companionship, you find that sometimes the smallest comfort, shared without ceremony, is enough to steady both body and spirit against the vast, indifferent cold. Midwinter arrives not with fanfare, but with a date circled carefully in a notebook. Outside, the sun has long since dipped below the horizon for its extended absence. The world beyond the hut is a study in blue-black shadow and silver starlight. Inside, however, there is a hum of anticipation. It is Midwinter's Day, the most important holiday of the Antarctic calendar. That's your mainstream historical fact. During the long polar winter, expeditions traditionally celebrated Midwinter's Day with special meals, decorations, and performances to boost morale during the darkest stretch of the year. You wake to the faint clatter of someone attempting to be stealthy in the galley area. It's not subtle. There's a suppressed curse as a tin slips and rolls across the floor. You smile into your blanket. Decorations have been improvised from whatever materials are at hand. Bits of colored paper saved from packaging. Scraps of fabric tied into small banners. Even a carefully preserved sprig of greenery, brought months ago and dried to near dust, has been placed in a tin as a symbolic centerpiece. And yes, the kettle is already on. The cook, having guarded certain ingredients for months, unveils a small triumph, a cake. It is modest in size, slightly lopsided, and baked in a tin that has seen better decades, but it is unmistakably a cake. Quirky tidbit: on Scott's expedition, the midwinter celebration in 1911 included a surprisingly elaborate meal with multiple courses. Thanks to careful rationing and planning, men donned their best remaining clothes and even composed menus with formal flair. You gather around the table as the cake is presented with exaggerated ceremony. Someone clears his throat and announces the Grand Antarctic Confection, as though unveiling a royal banquet. Applause follows, enthusiastic and slightly sleep-deprived. Tea is poured into mugs reserved for special occasions, less chipped, marginally more dignified. Historians still argue whether these celebrations significantly improved long-term morale or simply offered a temporary reprieve. Sitting here, watching tired faces soften in lantern light, you suspect even temporary reprieves can carry surprising power. The cake is sliced with careful precision to ensure fairness. Each portion is small but treasured. You take a bite and let the sweetness dissolve slowly. It tastes faintly of stored flour and determination. After the meal, speeches begin. Nothing grand, just short acknowledgments of shared hardship and quiet resilience. One man reads a humorous poem composed for the occasion, rhyming Antarctic with quite a trick. It earns a groan and then genuine laughter. Outside, the wind moves softly over the snow, less hostile tonight, as if respecting the occasion. You sip your tea and feel warmth spread outward from your chest. The hut glows faintly in the darkness, a fragile lantern against endless night. Games follow, simple ones. A quiz about geography, a mock awards ceremony where titles like most likely to misplace his mittens are bestowed with solemn gravitas. You clap for the recipient, who bows deeply, nearly knocking over a lantern in the process. Historians still argue whether such humor was a coping mechanism consciously cultivated or an organic response to isolation. It hardly matters in the moment. Laughter fills the hut, pushing back against the weight of months without sunlight. Later, someone produces a carefully saved tin of cocoa as an alternative to tea. Just for the evening, the old debate resurfaces playfully. You accept a small cup, savoring its richness, before returning to your steadfast tea. The contrast between outside and inside feels sharper tonight. Beyond the walls, darkness. Temperatures well below freezing. A continent asleep under starlight. Within, warmth, voices, crumbs of cake on wooden plates. You step outside briefly, mug in hand, to mark the day in your own quiet way. The sky is vast and clear, constellations blazing with an intensity rarely seen elsewhere. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a pale river. Your breath rises in slow clouds. The cold nips at your cheeks almost affectionately. Inside, someone begins singing softly, a familiar tune from home. Others join in, tentative at first, then steadier. The melody drifts through the hut and seeps out into the night air. Quirky as it sounds, you feel as though the continent is listening. You finish your tea and return indoors, closing the door firmly against the cold. The cake crumbs are being carefully gathered, nothing wasted. The decorations flutter slightly in a draft. There is something deeply human about insisting on celebration in a place so indifferent to human timelines. You have no trees, no candles beyond lanterns, no fresh ingredients, yet you have intention. The kettle is refilled once more, because even on midwinter's day, routine persists. You sit back, watching steam rise in delicate spirals, and let gratitude settle quietly. Not grand, not dramatic, just a steady acknowledgement of shared endurance. The night stretches long outside. The sun will not return for weeks yet. But tonight, in this small wooden hut at the end of the world, there has been cake, there has been laughter, there has been tea poured carefully into waiting hands. And in the heart of polar darkness, that feels almost like daylight. The first hint of rescue does not arrive with trumpets or dramatic music. It comes as a rumor of smoke on the horizon. You are outside, chipping ice from a sledge runner more out of habit than necessity. When someone calls out, at first, it's just a change in tone, less casual, more alert. You straighten, shading your eyes against the glare. There, far beyond the shifting edge of pack ice, a thin smudge interrupts the line where sea meets sky. Smoke. Your heart does something unfamiliar, an abrupt, hopeful lurch. That's your mainstream historical fact, after multiple failed attempts due to sea ice. Shackleton finally succeeded in rescuing the stranded men on Elephant Island in August 1916 aboard the Chilean vessel Yelcho. Every single man survived. You squint, trying to confirm what you think you see. The smudge grows incrementally darker. Someone beside you whispers, as though volume might frighten it away. Inside the shelter, the kettle is already on. It feels almost comedic. Rescue on the horizon. And still you melt snow. Historians still argue whether Shackleton's legend would be as enduring had even one man been lost during the ordeal. Survival, complete and total, shaped his reputation profoundly. As you watch that distant ship approach, you sense the weight of that possibility. The vessel inches closer, navigating carefully through scattered ice. You can make out its structure now. Dark hull cutting through pale water. Men gather on the shoreline. Some waving cautiously, others simply staring in stunned silence. Tea is poured with hands that shake, not from cold this time, but from disbelief. Quirky tidbit. When Shackleton finally reached Elephant Island to rescue his men, he reportedly asked, "Are you all well?" and received the reply, "All safe, all well." It was the simplest possible exchange after months of uncertainty. You imagine that moment now as the ship draws nearer. The wind carries faint sounds, engines, perhaps voices. You feel oddly suspended between two realities, the harsh rhythm of survival you've grown used to, and the structured world beyond the ice. Inside the shelter, mugs are passed around almost automatically. It is the final ordinary act before everything changes. The ship anchors as close as ice allows. A boat is lowered. Figures approach across choppy water. You recognize one silhouette, leaner than memory. Perhaps, but unmistakable. Shackleton stands at the bow. There is no grand speech. Just movement, quick head counts, firm handshakes, a flurry of preparation. You look back once at the shelter made from overturned boats and stone. It has been home in a way nothing else could be. Tea cools unnoticed in your mug. The transfer happens with efficient urgency. Supplies are gathered hastily. Personal items, diaries, small keepsakes, carefully bundled letters, are tucked into packs. There is no room for sentimentality in cargo weight, yet everyone carries something small. You step into the rescue boat, feeling it rock beneath your boots. The shoreline recedes slowly as you're ferried to the larger vessel. The shelter shrinks, then blends into the rocky coastline. On deck, the smell is different: coal smoke, oil, unfamiliar uniforms. It feels almost luxurious, though by ordinary standards it is anything but. A fresh pot of tea is brewed aboard the rescue ship. You accept a mug and marvel at the subtle difference in taste. Perhaps it's new leaves, perhaps simply relief. Historians still argue whether the psychological shift from survival mode to safety is as challenging as the ordeal itself. As you lean against the railing, watching Elephant Island fade into the distance, you feel both lighter and strangely unmoored. The routines that governed your days melt. Brew, haul, repeat, are dissolving. You glance at your mug. Steam rising steadily. The kettle here whistles with a slightly different pitch. It feels almost too easy. The ship turns northward, engines churning steadily. Ice begins to thin. Open water expands. You realize that this may be the last Antarctic tea break of this chapter of your life. You take your time with it. Around you, men speak more freely now. Laughter is louder, edged with disbelief. Stories begin to form even as they're told, already shaping memory into narrative. The continent behind you remains vast and unchanged. It does not celebrate your departure. It does not mourn it. But you carry something from it: a rhythm, a resilience, a deep appreciation for the simple miracle of boiling water in impossible places. As the rescue ship pushes toward safer latitudes, the air softens incrementally. The cold is still present, but less absolute. You finish your tea and set the mug down gently on the railing, careful not to spill a drop. Behind you, Antarctica stretches pale and immense. Ahead lies civilization, noise, warmth. And somewhere between the two, in the steam rising from a final mug on southern waters, you feel the quiet closing of a chapter written in ice. The years pass, and yet the kettle remains. You are no longer hauling sledges across pressure ridges or scanning horizons for rescue ships. Instead, you stand inside a modern Antarctic research station, steel-framed, insulated, humming gently with generators and satellite equipment. Outside, the wind still moves across the ice with the same ancient indifference. Inside, fluorescent lights glow softly above rows of computers. And in the corner of the communal kitchen, a kettle waits. That's your mainstream fact, today. Antarctica hosts dozens of research stations operated by various nations under the Antarctic Treaty System, which designates the continent for peaceful scientific use. Year-round and seasonal researchers study climate, glaciology, astronomy, and marine biology here. You run your hand along a countertop that feels almost suspiciously ordinary. The floor is level, The walls do not leak spindrift. There is central heating. It feels luxurious compared to the drafty wooden huts and overturned boats of the heroic age. Yet when someone announces, "Tea's on," the tone is instantly familiar. You watch scientists in fleece jackets and insulated boots gather with mugs in hand. They've just come in from checking ice cores drilled deep into the glacier, cylinders of frozen time that trap bubbles of ancient atmosphere. Climate data hums quietly on screens nearby. Historians still argue whether the early expeditions would recognize this version of Antarctica, less conquest, more cooperation. The flags still fly outside, but they represent research programs rather than territorial claims. You fill the kettle from a modern tap, water desalinated and filtered by machinery that would have seemed like sorcery to Scott or Shackleton. It clicks on with a tidy little switch instead of requiring coaxing from a temperamental Primus stove. Quirky tidbit. Some modern Antarctic stations have espresso machines capable of producing foam art. You stare at one suspiciously, as though expecting it to challenge the kettle to a duel. The researchers gather around a long table. There are laptops open, charts displayed, half-finished notes about sea ice extent and penguin migration patterns. Someone mentions that satellite data shows unusual thinning in a nearby ice shelf. The tone is serious but measured. Tea is poured. You notice how the act still creates a pause. Conversations soften. The urgency of data yields briefly to the ritual of steeping. Outside, the aurora australis flickers faintly across the dark sky, a curtain of green and violet light rippling silently. You step to the window, mug warming your hands, and watch it dance. In the distance, automated weather stations blink steadily, transmitting information to networks that span the globe. Antarctica is no longer silent in the way it once was. It speaks through numbers now. Historians still argue whether the romanticism of the heroic age obscures its hardships too conveniently. Modern researchers benefit from technology, real-time communication, emergency evacuation plans, and yet, when storms pin them indoors for days, when the sun vanishes for winter, the psychological terrain remains familiar. You take a sip and feel that same spreading warmth you knew in a wooden hut lit by lantern. Someone at the table tells a story about Shackleton's rescue, about Scott's careful menus, about midwinter cakes baked against the odds. The legends persist, retold between updates on ice core isotopes and penguin nesting counts. There's a continuity here that transcends equipment upgrades. The kettle clicks off with a polite snap. Steam curls upward in gentle spirals. You realize that while the motivations have shifted, from planting flags to studying climate systems, the human need for pause, for shared warmth, remains unchanged. Outside, wind drifts snow across the surface in delicate ribbons. Inside, laughter rises briefly over a joke about how even at the bottom of the world, someone forgot to restock the biscuits. You lean back in your chair and let your gaze soften. The Antarctic night presses lightly against reinforced windows. The aurora fades to a faint shimmer. Computers continue their quiet vigilance. Tea cools slowly in your mug. And as you sit there, centuries of polar history seem to settle gently around you, not as dramatic races or desperate rescues, but as small, steady rituals repeated against a vast white backdrop. The kettle, in all its iterations, iron, dented, electric, has been witness to frostbite and feast days, rivalry and rescue, isolation and innovation. You take one last sip and set the mug down. The lights inside the station dim slightly as evening protocols begin. Conversations taper. Someone yawns. Outside, the ice creaks softly, shifting in slow, ancient rhythms. You feel no urgency now. Just the steady hum of warmth against cold. The quiet company of others. The comfort of knowing that even here, especially here, humans have learned to carve out small circles of heat and habit in an environment that offers none freely. Your breathing slows. The wind moves across the continent as it always has, brushing snow over forgotten footprints, over old hut sites, over the memory of sled tracks long erased. Inside, the kettle rests, ready for morning. And you let your thoughts drift outward across the ice, past research stations and rescue ships, past wooden huts and Primus stoves, until they dissolve into the wide, pale silence of Antarctica at night. The air feels softer now. The darkness less imposing. You are warm. You are still. And somewhere, in the gentle echo of boiling water in a far-off corner of the world, the story settles into quiet. Sleep comes lightly, like snow falling without a sound. End of script. Sweet dreams.